Lee Strobel, how's it going today?
It's going great, Billy. Great to see you again.
Well, great to see you. You have another exciting project coming out, this film, The Case for Heaven. You also have the book, The Case for Heaven. And I got to tell
Right.
you, you have had an incredible writing career, obviously, as we all know. You started with The Case for Christ and you've worked your way down on so many important faith topics. Why did you want to start diving into this study and this exploration of heaven?
Well, I almost died 10 years ago. My wife found me unconscious. She called an ambulance. I remember waking up in the emergency room and looking up at the physician. He looked down at me and he said, "You're one step away from a coma, two steps away from dying."
Wow.
And so I lingered between life and death there for quite a while. I had a rare condition called hyponatremia, which is a severe drop in my blood sodium level. And so when you're in that position, it's a very clarifying situation to be on the edge of, you don't know if you're going to live, if you're going to die. And, as a Christian, I believe what the Bible teaches about the afterlife. But at the same time, I've got this skeptical gear. My background's in journalism and law, so I tend to question things. And so after I recovered from that, thank God, I thought, I should really look at what the evidence is that supports the idea that there is an afterlife, that we do indeed live on. Because at a moment like that, nothing is more important than what happens after I close my eyes for the last time in this world.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And when you go through an experience like that, it's eye-opening. It changes everything. And as
Yeah.
somebody, you've investigated everything else, I feel like, under the faith sphere. So to dive into this, what made you want to say, so you did the book. The book came out last year. Now the film is coming out. It's a three-night exciting release in April here, coming up. Why did
Yes.
you say to yourself, okay, we've done the book. Now I really want to take this to the big screen?
You know, Cinema is the language of young people. Not that they don't read books anymore, but so many young people, this is their language, this is their chosen way to communicate is through film and cinema and so forth. So I wanted to reach a different audience. It's interesting. It's the same material basically, but it's presented a different way, and I think it appeals to different people. So I'm hoping that perhaps a younger demographic might be exposed to this kind of reasoning and evidence than otherwise would be through the book. So it's a different experience, different demographic. I'm all about trying to reach as many people as I can with the gospel. And when Manny Sandoval, who's a friend of mine, he used to be with PureFlix and just a great guy, approached me about doing a film. I said, let's do this one. And he got excited about it. And so we launched on it. And, it's funny because it's a documentary. But when people say documentary, they kind of picture, oh, that's, some people in a enclosed room with talking heads and so forth. This is a beautiful doc. We went to all over the country to film this. We were in Oregon, we were in Washington, D.C., Houston, Chicago, Sedona. They went to Cambridge, England. I mean, it's a cinema. The cinematography is just stunning in this film. So I hope people don't get the idea that, oh, it's a documentary, it sounds boring. I hope they say, wow, this is kind of a new form of communication. It's a documentary, but it's kind of turbocharged by Manny Sandoval's creative zeal.
Yeah, the Sandovals do great work, and when you look at the trailer of the film, it's incredible. It looks really fascinating, really captivating. And I want to get into the meat of the topic. We talked about the film here. We talked
Yeah.
about the fact that you almost died. That obviously changes things. You go on this journey as you started to explore whether or not there was evidence for heaven. And again, you're a believer.
Yeah.
You've been a believer for a long time.
Yeah.
You know that there's a heaven, but as you started to dig into it and really look and explore, what most surprised you?
I tell you, I was completely surprised by the evidence for near death experiences. I was a skeptic about it. I thought maybe it was just a lack of oxygen to the brain that caused hallucinations or something like that. And what I discovered is that there have been more than 900 scholarly studies of near death experiences published in scientific and medical journals over the last 50 years. It's a very well studied phenomenon. And the Lancet, which is the famous medical journal in England, carried an article that analyzed near-death experiences, said that no alternative explanation can account for this phenomenon. So, and I know there have been people who have made claims about, oh, I died, I met Jesus, he's 5'10", brown eyes, nice guy. I mean, I can't confirm that. I don't know if that's true or not. And there have been some fraudulent cases along those lines. So I only looked at cases where we had corroboration. And kind of, from my legal background, I wanted cases where people saw things or heard things that they could not have seen or heard had they not had an authentic out-of-body experience. And we have 21 cases that have been studied that where people were blind, most of them blind since birth, and yet during their near-death experience, they could see for the first time. They saw people trying to resuscitate them, their bodies, they saw plants and animals and things for the first time. And then when they were revived, the eyesight was gone, which is one researcher said that's medically impossible. There's another study of 93 cases of people who made verifiable observations during their out-of-body experience, of which 92% were completely accurate, another 6% were almost completely accurate. That's 98% accuracy. So I looked at, I'll give you one quick example. My favorite one is a woman named Maria who died in a hospital. And she described later, said, well, I was conscious the whole time. I was watching the resuscitation efforts that they were doing on my body. My spirit was kind of floating there in the hospital room. And then my spirit floated out of the hospital. And when she was revived and her spirit returned to her body, she said, oh, by the way, there's a man's tennis shoe on the roof of the hospital. And it's dark blue. It's left-footed. There's some wear over the little toe. And the shoelace is tucked under the heel. So they go up, they look, and sure enough, they found it exactly as she said. So that's the kind of corroboration I'm looking for. And in my book and in the film, we document these cases. I think it's extraordinary.
Well, first of all, that story absolutely is extraordinary, and I know you have other stories like that in the book. You are a facts guy, as you said. You go for the facts, you go for evidence, and obviously you're a journalist. You were trained as a journalist. You worked as a journalist for a long time. That is the best person to look at these sorts of issues because you're not going to just take a story at face value. You're going to go and how else would somebody know? And I think this is the question that critics and skeptics are faced with, that there was a very specific shoe. They knew what foot, they knew what color on a roof they had never been on, right? It's remarkable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know what the other remarkable thing is, Billy, that surprised me about near-death experiences? John Burke, who happened to be a friend of mine for about the last, 30 years. We used to be on the staff together of a church years ago. But John Burke is a Christian pastor in Austin, Texas, of a large church. He's also studied 1,000 near-death experiences over the last 30 years. His conclusion, this is radical, his conclusion is when you look at what actually takes place in the typical near-death experience, it is consistent with Christian theology. So I thought that was a real breakthrough analysis of saying, wait a minute, this is not just some random near-death experience. This is consistent with what we're told in Scripture about the afterlife.
Yeah, and there are so many debates in this arena, right? When you die, do you fall asleep until the end of days, right? Do you go directly to heaven? There's so many of these theological debates and discussions. Where do you, and I think I know where you land, but where do you land on that particular discussion?
Yeah, the Apostle Paul said to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And so I believe scripturally that what happens when we die is that our spirit, our soul, our consciousness separates from our physical body, which is now deceased, and it goes to what's called the intermediate state, either in the presence of God or away from the presence of God. And then at the consummation of history, when Jesus returns, when we're reunited with our resurrected bodies, we go through final judgment, and at that point, then we spend eternity in a very physical place, whether it's heaven or hell. I think that's my best understanding of what Scripture teaches, and it's confirmed by the study of near-death experiences and also studies into whether or not we have a soul. I have a whole chapter in my book where I interviewed a neuroscientist named Dr. Sharon Dirks, who is a PhD from Cambridge University, showing that yes, we are not just a body, we're just not just neurons that fire in our brain, but we have a soul, we have a spirit, we have a consciousness that's distinct from our physical bodies, and that is able to survive, as the near-death experiences confirm and as the Bible talks about.
Yeah, you also have Jesus telling the thief on the cross that he'll be with him today. He's not saying you'll be with me at the end of
Exactly.
days. He's saying you'll be with me
Right.
today. So there seems to be quite a
Yep.
bit in scripture on that. Why do you think, and you mentioned some of the reasons earlier, this is one of those topics, and you and I have talked a lot about a variety of topics where this happens, where
Yeah.
people sort of get fired up and they'll point to the examples that maybe weren't true, the few of them that have come out to be, the Malarkey family and a number of others who've
Right.
come out. But why do you think there's such a pushback and a debate? There's some people who see this as completely scripturally
Yeah.
sound, and there's others who say no, near-death experiences don't line up with scripture. What drives that second group?
Yeah, it's a good question. We can look at people like Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. J.P. Moreland, two highly respected evangelical Christian philosophers who've been writing about near-death experiences since about 1994. I mean, they go way back in talking about these things. Even R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul theologian, said these things ought to be investigated. So I think we ought to be open to what the evidence shows us. Now, I think John Burke did a breakthrough study because what he pointed out is so many people who have gone through near-death experiences, whether they're positive or negative, about 24% are negative. They're hellish experiences. We talk about that in the movie and in the book. But they go through this experience and they interpret it through their theological or philosophical lens. And so they kind of see, I'll give you an example. You could have a Hindu who has a near-death experience and then encounters a being of light who has a book. And they interpret that as being, oh, that's the book of karma. And I'm going to be reincarnated, and he's trying to figure out what karma I have to pay back, what bad karma I have to deal with. Well, it's also consistent with Christian theology that God would have a book, the book of life. And so what John Burke emphasized, and I think this is so good, is that you have to look at what actually takes place in these experiences, not how people interpret them. And then they tend to be consistent with Christian theology. He wrote a wonderful book called Imagine Heaven that was a New York Times bestseller that dealt with this in depth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's been so much discussion and, so much, debate, but I think it's such an amazing topic. And for someone like you to
Yeah.
dive in after what you went through. So let's just, as we round out to a close here, talk a little bit about your experience. Obviously, you had your own, experience there where you were very ill. You go into this
Yeah.
topic, you explore it. You've done a book and a movie on it now. What did it do for you spiritually, kind of going on that investigation?
Well, I'm 70 years old now and getting toward the end of my life. Who knows how many years I have left? If I'm an average American, less than 10 years. And when you get older, like I am now, you really take more seriously what happens when we pass from this world. And I think this research has given me fresh confidence, fresh hope, fresh assurance that what the Bible teaches is true. We have all the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And if he was resurrected from the dead, he's the Son of God. He created the afterlife. We ought to listen to what he says. And so I explore that as well. But I think what's interesting is the timing in our culture. Of course, I didn't intend it this way, but with COVID, 29% of Americans know someone who's died in the pandemic. My older brother died at the beginning of the pandemic. And it's made, I think, the populace in general more attuned to the question of what does happen when we die. Leslie and I were at a restaurant a while back, and there was a waitress, maybe 18 years old. And we're talking to her, and she begins to cry. And we said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I almost didn't come into work today. We just lost a family member to COVID." And I thought, here's an 18-year-old woman who probably never thought about death before. Why should she? She got her whole life ahead of her. And yet you could see the anxiety and the apprehension in her eyes. And it just reminded me that we have a whole new generation that's kind of faced death in the eye during the COVID crisis and pandemic. And so this topic, I think, has become ever more relevant in our culture, even to young people who want some assurance about how do I know what I know?
Well, listen, Lee, thank you so much for coming on today. The film is The Case for Heaven. We hope to have you back sometime very soon.
Thanks so much, Billy. Appreciate you.